of Jonathan Frid at the Tamahak Club. In a few moments, Mr. Frid will present the appetizer. As I said earlier, after we have had dessert and we are having coffee, we will have a second performance, and I'd appreciate your cooperation at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening. Don't let the frivolousness of the title, My Fridian Connections, etc., fool you. Among the appetizers, there is a mad, nameless killer from the mind of Edgar Allan Poe to titillate your palate. My first piece is very short, a fable that ought to tempt you to taste the next. Appointment in Samara. Death speaks. There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to market to buy provisions. And in a little while the servant came back white and trembling and said, "Master, just now when I was in the marketplace I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when I turned I saw it was death that jostled me. She looked at me and made a threatening gesture. Now lend me your horse, and I will ride away from this city and avoid my fate. I will go to Samara, and there death will not find me." The merchant lent him his horse, and the servant mounted it, and he dug his spurs in its flanks, and as fast as the horse could gallop he went. Then the merchant went down to the marketplace, and he saw me standing there in the crowd. And he came to me and said, "Why did you make a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning?" "That was not a threatening gesture," I said. "It was only a start of surprise. I was astonished to see him in Baghdad, for I had an appointment with him tonight in Samara." You wouldn't want to sit here at table and break bread with the creature of this next piece, but let us at least hear him out, and then we'll send him on his way. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. And whenever I looked at it, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, it's about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, cautiously. Cautiously, because the hinges creaked. And I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed. And so it was impossible for me to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. On the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly and as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was black as pitch with a thick darkness, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up on the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle. In the meantime, he was still sitting in the bed listening. I did not hear him lie down. He was still listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watch beetles in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not the groan of pain or of grief. Oh, no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying there, awake ever since the first slight noise when he turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "There's nothing but the wind in the chimney. It's just a mouse crossing the floor. Merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very little crevice in the lantern. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's person. But I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses? I say there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could to maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. Yet for some time I refrained and kept still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there for many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe to you the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the floorings of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I'd been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. Well, I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. A suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police station, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I now to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was mine own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct, and I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. Oh, no doubt I grew pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I arose and argued about trifles, and the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, but the noise arose over all. It grew louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible that they heard it not? Almighty God, they heard. They suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. Anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. Again, hark, hark, louder, louder. Villains, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here it is, the beating of his hideous heart. Now, as we approach dinner, well, oh, bless you. Oh. Somewhat improved since Cornwall, I hope. Well, the word conscience, it seems to have become a recurring theme of mine, expressing itself in roles I've done in the past, and indeed with some of the selections that I have chosen for these evenings of Reader's Theater. Well, here's a piece of advice on this subject, both for me and the poor little fellow in Mr. Poe's story, from the pen of Ogden Nash. It has a title, all right. It goes, Reflection on the Fallibility of Nemesis. He was ridden by a conscience who worries about a lot of nonsense. He, without benefit of scruples, his fun and income soon quadruples. Well, succinct enough? Listen to this. Reflection on a wicked world. Purity is obscurity. Now, I must tell you here that every time I do these shows commercially, there are royalty fees to be paid out to living authors or still existing estates. In Nash's case, it amounts to $3 a verse. Well, that's not bad, really, but with his short and snappy verses, the fee can soon mount up. Especially when you consider verses like Reflection on a Wicked World. It's only 3 words. It's $1 a word there. So you see, I'm getting more mileage out of Nash talking about him than I am reading him. It's cheaper. Well, I suppose I really ought to stick more to works that are in what they call the public domain, which means, of course, that the authors have been dead a decent length of time. Or more to the point, their lawyers have been dead a decent length of time. And therefore they come totally free. Well, I can't wait to debut my newest show for the college circuit in March. The title takes its cue from that of my original show, Jonathan Frid's Fools and Fiends. It's called Shakespeare's Fools and Fiends. That means nobody else's. It will be even cheaper. Well, I should have no royalty problems with this next piece. I concocted it myself. My Fridian connections. Problems of another kind, perhaps. That is, if I'm hounded by families and clans whose good names I bandy about a little, all in jest, mind you. It's a genealogical odyssey into the Frid name. Here goes my conscience again. I'm reminded of a little verse I once heard. See, see, the family tree. Better off to let well enough be. Nevertheless, an odd sound, Frid. Because I'm an actor, I suppose, I've always tended to hear it as strangers might hear it. Many, hearing the name for the first time, think I'm leaving something out. Something missing. Frid what? They think maybe it's a prefix like Van or Von or Fitz. But Frid it is. No cadence, no melody, just Frid. Well, at least you wouldn't think that anyone would have difficulty spelling it or pronouncing it. But I've heard everything. Fred, Fried, Frit, Frood, Fried, and even Freud. Well, when I was back in England some years ago, studying and working and playing in London, I found that the British had as much trouble pronouncing Frid as Canadians and Americans. And so I got the brilliant idea of changing the spelling to F-R-I-D-D. That definitive extra D certainly seemed to do the trick. I began to use this while in repertory in Kent in the south of England. But my triumph was short-lived. You see, I had forgotten that my grandfather, Frid, had been born in Kent almost a century earlier, until some visitors to the theater came up to me one night and announced that they were relatives. Well, they had guessed at our connection from my bio notes in the program. We talked briefly and discussed that extra D a little. My father, back in Canada, was mildly amused by this chance meeting of distant cousins from the old world, but not so amused by new spelling of his name. I think he was ready to disown me on the spot. No la-di-da F-R-I-D-D spelling of our name, he wrote back. So back to F-R-I-D it went, mispronunciations and all. This obsession with the sound and the genealogy of the Frid name had its genesis, of course, in my adolescent imaginings. I began pestering my father about it. Well, oh, he would chuckle at me patronizingly. What do you care about all that stuff for? You see, my father, as many of you know, and his father before him came from that breed of self-made men who always looked ahead and not caring a damn really about ancestry. What little he could tell me, however, or all that he wanted to tell me, was that in 1860 my grandfather and his brothers came from Raynham, Kent, in the south of England, settled in Hamilton, Ontario, and established roots there in bricks, the Frid brothers' brickyards. Now, this indifference to family trees was much the same on at least one side of my mother's family. Her father, John McGregor, one of those legendary rural horse and buggy doctors at the turn of the century, made little mention of his family to his children, although it was far from dull, as it turns out. But his wife, Liza, was very much into her lineage. Liza had been born a Mackenzie. Very proud was she of the Mackenzie connection. I myself have heard tell that Liza was not too pleased at first about her daughter Flora becoming engaged back in 1917 to Herb Frid. Just who was he, went out the whispers from the Imperial Gingerbread Palace in Waterdown, Ontario. Isn't he one of the brick people from Hamilton? Meanwhile, back to the dark void of the Frid roots. A casual genealogical exploration was begun about a year ago at the New York Public Library by a friend and colleague of ours, Nancy Kersey, whose curiosity had been whetted by my flotsam telltales about the family in New York. Well, straight off, she found some startling revelations, the best of which I'm going to put on the back burner for a moment. With each new revelation, Nancy became more determined than ever to go through with this project. Here's one of them. In a genealogical study entitled Surnames of the Fossils of Speech, compiled by Samuel L. Brown, we find under the listing Frid on page 111 these items. 1. Frid, Old English, Frid or Frith, meaning a refuge or haven. 2. Old English Frith, F-R-Y-T-H-E, a woods or forest. 3. Descendant of Frido, Sounds like a potato chip. But it's an old High German personal name meaning peace. I rather like that. Then, in a dictionary of British surnames edited by Percy Hildy Rennie, published in London and Boston by Rutledge and Cape Hall Company, there appears on page 120 the following item, which describes the various common forms of this name in the 11th century. It begins under the heading Firth, which leads to Frith, F-R-I-T-H, Frid, F-R-I-D, and Frid, F-R-I-D-D. It would seem that some poor luckless Dane or Angle or Celt or back in the millennium ago was fit to be tied just like me, listening to the mispronunciation of his name, and changed it to F-R-I-D-D. And we have no source that says that his dad chopped off his head. Next, Frid, F-R-Y-D. Well, that's quite elegant. But that could be pronounced fried. Anyway, I don't suppose the old man would have gone for that either. So, Freed, Vred, V-R-E-D-E. Brift, Firk, Firks, Thrift, Freak. And there are three versions. F-R-E-A-K, F-R-E-A-K-E, and F-R-E-K-E. Three branches of the freaks. Wait a minute. Fright, F-R-I-G-H-T, especially in Kent, where the surname is common. And so it would seem that in County Kent, the Frids first settled as Frights. Well, I guess I've come by my reputation honestly. I suppose it was that discovery that urged our Miss Kersey into going beyond the bounds of conventional research, for she ended up finding the word Frid listed on page 182 of an encyclopedia of fairies, hobgoblins, brownies, bogies, and other supernatural creatures. Edited by Catherine Briggs in 1976. Ms. Briggs describes a Frid as a supernatural creature which lives under the rocks in the highlands and which devours all milk or crumbs spilled on the ground. Ms. Briggs goes on to quote one of her sources, a Donald Mackenzie, who wrote about the habits of these Frid creatures in his study of Scottish folklore and folk life, published in London, 1935, which details on page 244 that it is likely that the Fridian, so that's what they called our tribe, it is likely that the Fridian were the original beings to which the libations of milk were poured upon the hills of Gairloch, Ross, and Cromarty. The fairly widespread tale of a piper who, followed by his dog, explored the windings of an underground cavern and never returned from it, is related to the Fridian. The dog returned hairless, as dogs do from encounters with fairies, and died when it came out in the open. Now, just who was this Donald Mackenzie? I'll bet you one hairless dog that guy was related to Liza, knew her well, was in cahoots with her, and egged her on to object to this match of her daughter Flora to Herb Frid. No member of their family was going to marry not only a brickman, but one who lived under rocks. Oh no, from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go poof in the night. Dear Lord, deliver us. However, love conquered all. Herb got to marry Flora, and here I am to tell the tale. Meanwhile, the Fridian tribe is still very much alive and well in Hamilton, Ontario. Their roots and bricks and rocks, now lost in legend. Thank you. No, she would have disowned me on the spot, too. Oh, God, they're rolling in their graves right now, let me tell you. Oh, Lord. Oh, yeah, I think she would have. I think she would have. I think Dad might have kind of throttled a little, sort of. But anyway, oh, no, I think they, God knows, they told their own stories in their own way, so this is my way of telling it. But I love it.
This knock comes down.
No, look, you have to get your microphone on.
Well, my mic's right here. But anyway, I've lost Mr. Benchley.
You what?
Somewhere back in Tilton Place. I've never done this before, but so we're going to jump right into to Nash again, and then I do Turber, and then we'll see. I happen to have something up along with it. I don't know whether it will go later or not, but anyway, we'll get this part finished. So, in all fairness to Ogden Nash, remember him before dinner? Well, I think I owe an encore, a more respectable showing in the way of a somewhat longer poem. After all, if I'm going to shell out another $3, I want to get my money. Love. Under the Republicans or Democrats. Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove of a marriage conducted with economy in the 20th century anno domini. We'll live in a dear little walk-up flat with practically room to swing a cat, and a potted cactus to give hauteur, and a bathtub equipped with a dark brown water. We'll eat without undue discouragement, foods low in cost but high in nourishment, and quaff with pleasure while chatting wittily the peculiar wine of Little Italy. We'll remind each other it's smart to be thrifty and buy our clothes for something 50. We'll stand in line on holidays for seats at unpopular matinees, and every Sunday we'll have a lark and take a walk in Central Park. And one of these days, not too remote, I'll probably up and cut your throat. All of which puts me in mind of one of H.L. Menken's maxims. A man may be a fool and not know it, but not if he's married. This leads us quite deftly, I think, right into my next piece. Mr. Preble gets rid of his wife. By James Thurber. Mr. Preble was a plump, middle-aged lawyer in Scarsdale. He used to kid with his stenographer about running away with him. Let's run away together, he would say during a pause in dictation. Oh, righty, she would say. One rainy Monday afternoon, Mr. Preble was more serious about it than usual. Let's run away together, said Mr. Preble. All righty, said his stenographer. Mr. Preble jingled the keys in his pocket and looked out the window. My wife would be glad to get rid of me, he said. Would she give you a divorce? Asked the stenographer. I don't suppose so, he said. The stenographer laughed. Well, you'd have to get rid of your wife, she said. Mr. Preble was unusually silent at dinner that night. About half an hour after coffee, he spoke without looking up from his paper. Let's go down on the cellar, Mr. Preble said. What for? She said, not looking up from her book. Oh, I don't know, he said.
We never go down in the cellar anymore. The way we used to. We never did go down in the cellar that I remember. I could rest easy the balance of my life if I never went down in the cellar. Mr. Preble was silent for several minutes. Well, supposing I said it meant a whole lot to me, began Mr. Preble. What's come over you? His wife demanded. It's cold down there. There's absolutely nothing to do. Well, we can pick up pieces of coal. I get up some kind of a game with pieces of coal. I don't want to, said his wife. But anyway, I'm reading. Listen, said Mr. Preble, rising and walking up and down. Why won't you come down in the cellar? You can read down there as far as that goes. There isn't a good enough light down there, she said. And anyway, I'm not going to go down in the cellar. You may as well make up your mind to that. Gee whiz, said Mr. Preble, kicking at the edge of a rug. Other people's wives go down in the cellar. I mean, never want to do anything. I'm worn up from the office, and you won't even go down in the cellar with me. God knows it isn't very far. It's as if I was asking you to go to the movies or something. I don't want to go, shouted Mr. Preble. Mr. Preble sat down on the edge of a davenport. All right, he said. Picked up the newspaper again. I wish you'd let me tell you more about it. It's kind of a surprise. Will you quit harping on that subject? Asked Mrs. Preble. Listen, said Mr. Preble, leaping to his feet. I might as well tell you the truth instead of beating around the bush. I want to get rid of you so I can marry my stenographer. Is there anything essentially wrong about that? People do it every day. Love is something you can't control. We've been all over that, said Mrs. Preble. I'm not going to go all over that again. Well, I just wanted you to know how things are, said Mr. Preble. You have to take everything so literally. Lord, do you suppose I really wanted to go down there and make up some silly game with pieces of coal? I never believed that for a minute, said Mrs. Preble. I knew all along you wanted to get me down there and bury me. Oh, you can say that now after I told you, said Mr. Preble. It would never have occurred to you if I hadn't. You didn't tell me. I got it out of you, said Mrs. Preble. Anyway, I'm always 2 steps ahead of what you're thinking. You're never within a mile of what I'm thinking, said Mr. Preble. Is that so? I knew you wanted to bury me the minute you set foot in this house tonight. Mrs. Preble held a little glare. Now that's just plain damn exaggeration, said Mr. Preble, considerably annoyed. You knew nothing of the sort. As a matter of fact, I never thought of it until just a few minutes ago. Oh, it was in the back of your mind, said Mrs. Preble. I suppose this filing woman put you up to it. Now, you needn't get sarcastic, said Mr. Preble. I have plenty of people to file without having her file. She doesn't know anything about this. She isn't in on it. I was going to tell her you'd gone to visit some friends and fell over a cliff. She wants me to get a divorce. Oh, that's a laugh, said Mrs. Preble. That's a laugh. You may bury me, but you'll never get a divorce. She knows that. I told her that, said Mr. Preble. I told her I'd never get a divorce. Oh, you probably told her about burying me, too, said Mrs. Preble. That's not true, said Mr. Preble with dignity. That's between you and me. I was never going to tell a soul. Oh, blab it to the whole world. Don't tell me, said Mrs. Preble. I know you. Mr. Preble puffed at a cigar. Wish you were buried now and it was all over with, he said. Don't you suppose you'd get caught, you crazy thing, she said. They always get caught. Now why don't you go to bed? You're just getting yourself worked up over nothing. I'm not going to go to bed, said Mr. Preble. I'm going to bury you in the cellar. I've got my mind made up to it. I don't know how I can make it any plainer. Well, listen, cried Mrs. Preble, throwing your book down. Will you be satisfied and shut up if I go down in the cellar? Can I have a little peace if I go down in the cellar? Will you let me alone then? Yes, said Mr. Preble, but you spoil it by taking that attitude. Sure, I always spoil everything. I stop reading right in the middle of a chapter. I'll never know how the story comes out, but that's nothing to you. Did I make you start reading the book? Asked Mr. Preble. He opened the cellar door. Here, you go first. Mrs. Preble, starting up the steps. It's cold down here. You would think of this at this time of year. Any other husband would have buried his wife in the summer. When you can't arrange these things just whenever you want to, said Mr. Preble. I didn't fall in love with this girl in the late fall. Well, anybody else would have fallen in love with her long before that. She's been around for years. Why do you always let other men get in ahead of you? Mercy down here. What have you got there? Well, I was going to hit you over the head with this shovel. You were, huh? Well, get that out of your mouth. Do you want to leave a great big clue right here in the middle of everything with a first detective that comes sneaking around will find it? Out in the street you find some piece of iron or something. Something that doesn't belong to you. Oh, all right, said Mr. Preble. But there won't be a piece of iron in the street. Women always expect to pick up a piece of iron anywhere. If you look in the right place, you'll find it, said Mrs. Preble. And don't you be gone long. Don't you dare stop in at that cigar store. I'm not going to stand down here in this cold cellar all night and freeze. All right, said Mr. Preble. I'll hurry. And shut that door behind you. She screamed after him. Where were you born? In a barn? The last little tag of this part of the program anyway, a very brief excursion into science fiction with a rather sinister machine that gets us one way or another to the end. Professor Jones had been working on time theory for many years. And I had found the key equation, he told his daughter one day. Time is a field. This machine I have made can manipulate, even reverse that field. Pushing a button as he spoke, he said, this should make time run backward. Run time makes this. Said he spoke, he had button the push. That reverse, he manipulated, made by machine this. Speed, time. This old heat. Equation, T, the pound device. Every time on working with Had Jones Professor. M. E. Now, for you to get your money's worth, whether you like this or not, but we're leaving out for Mr. Benchley, and if you can put up with it, I do one of my very favorites, and I have, I think, success with it. It's some piece of it's in preparation for my new show coming up, Shakespeare Schools and Beats, and this is from Richard III, 2 or 3 short excerpts from that play. Are we ready for that? Well, I haven't done this in a few weeks, so we'll see what happens, but I think it'll work. Hopefully. The Wars of the Roses. England's longest and bloodiest civil war, ending with the victory for the House of York, the White Rose, and defeat for King Henry VI, head of the House of Lancaster, the Red Rose. Richard, Duke of York, who everyone assumed would become king with the victory on his side, was killed near the end of the war, and power fell instead to the Duke's 3 sons. His eldest, Edward, who became Edward IV, his second son, George, Duke of Clarence, and the youngest, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the bunch-backed toad, as old Queen Margaret dubbed him. Shakespeare's play is simply the story of Gloucester's seizure of the crown and of his downfall, culminating in his death on the battlefield by the sword of Henry Tudor, as he cries out in abject despair, a horse, a kingdom for a horse. But at the beginning of the play, then, Richard's oldest brother reigns as Edward IV, thus standing directly in the way of Richard's path to the throne of the king himself, along with his 2 sons, the 2 boy princes, about whose imprisonment in the tower legends abound, and one of whom reigns for a matter of weeks as Edward V. And then there's George, his second brother, Duke of Clarence. But in the opening soliloquy, the York family, Richard is telling us, is enjoying the fruits of its great victory with many festive celebrations. But that is not all of what Richard tells us. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war had smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking grass, I that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, the form, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to see my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to play a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots that I lay, inductions dangerous, my drunken prophecies, libels and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate the one against the other. And if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false, and treacherous, this day should Clarence closely be mewed up about a prophecy which says that G of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be. Die thoughts, my soul, here Clarence comes. Oh, brother, good day. What means this armored guard that waits upon your grace? His Majesty, tendering my person's safety, hath appointed this conduct to convey me to the Tower. Upon what cause? Because my name is George. Alack, my lord, that fault is none of yours. He should for that commit your godfathers. Oh, belike his Majesty had some intent that you should be new christened in the Tower. But what's the matter, Clarence? May I know? Yea, Richard, when I know, for I protest as yet I do not. But as I can learn, he hearkens after prophecies and dreams, and from the crossroad plucks the letter G, and says a wizard told him that by G his issue disinherited should be. And for my name of George begins with G, it follows in his thought that I am he. These, as I learn, and such like toys as these, have moved his highness to commit me now. Why, this it is when men are ruled by women. 'Tis not the king that sends you to the Tower, my Lady Grey, his wife. Clarence, it is she that tempers him to this extremity. Was it not she and that good man of worship, Anthony Woodville, her brother there, that made him send Lord Hastings to the Tower, from whence this present day he is delivered? Oh, we are not safe, Clarence, we are not safe. Brackenbury the guard, I beseech your graces both to pardon me. His Majesty hath straitly given in charge that no man shall have private conference of what degree soe'er with your brother. Brother, farewell. I will unto the king, and whatsoever you will employ me in, were to call King Edward's widow sister, I will perform it to enfranchise you. Meantime, this deep disgrace of brotherhood touches me deeper than you can imagine. I know it pleases neither of us well. Well, your imprisonment shall not be long. I will deliver you or else lie for you. In the meantime, have patience. I must perforce. Farewell. Exeunt Clarence Brackenbury in the guard. Go, tread the path that thou shalt ne'er return. Simple, plain Clarence. I do love thee so that I shall shortly send thy soul to heaven, if heaven will take the present at our hands. But who comes here? The new delivered Hastings. Good time of day unto my gracious lord. Well, as much unto my good lord Chamberlain. Well are you welcome to this open air. How hath your lordship brooked imprisonment? With patience, noble lord, as prisoners must. But I shall live, my lord, to give them thanks that were the cause of my imprisonment. Oh, no doubt, no doubt. So shall Clarence too, for they that were your enemies are his, and have prevailed as much on him as you. What news abroad? No news so bad abroad as this at home. The king is sickly, weak, and melancholy, and his physicians fear him mightily. Oh, now by St. Paul, that news is bad indeed. Oh, he hath kept an evil diet long, and overmuch consumed his royal person. It is very grievous to be thought upon. Where is he? In his bed? He is. Oh, go you before, and I will follow you. He cannot live. I hope. And must not die till George be packed with post-horse up to heaven. I'll in to urge his hatred more to Clarence, with lies well steeled with weighty arguments. And if I fail not in my deep intent, Clarence hath not another day to live. Which done, God take King Henry to his mercy, and leave the world for me to bustle in. For then I'll marry Warwick's youngest daughter. What though I killed her husband and her father? Well, the readiest way to make the wench amends is to become her husband and her father. Which will I, not all so much for love as for another secret close intent, by marrying her, which I must reach unto. But yet I run before my horse to market. Clarence still breathes. Edward still lives and reigns. When they are gone, then must I count my gains. H.L. Mencken, another definition. His definition of conscience. It fits Richard rather nicely. The inner voice that warns us someone may be looking. We now leap forward into the action. It is Richard's coronation, and indeed many in the court are looking, and outside of the court. They're watching carefully, coldly, many frightened. One of them, his first lieutenant, the Duke of Buckingham, the kingmaker himself, who till now has conspired to put Richard on the throne. In the beginning, it was all smooth as silk for Richard, but the gathering storm begins to make itself felt. Henry Tudor has raised an army against him, and one by one Richard's followers go over to the other side. Yet Richard is still obsessed with the one single obstacle remaining before his claim to the throne is absolutely secured. Listen to Richard at the culmination of his coronation ceremony as he summons Buckingham to his side. Stand all apart, cousin of Buckingham, my gracious sovereign. Give me thy hand. Thus high by thy advice and thy assistance is King Richard seated. But shall we wear these glories for a day, or shall they last and we rejoice in them? Well, still live they, and forever let them last. Ah, Buckingham, now do I play the touch to try if thou be current gold indeed. Young Edward lives. Think now what I would speak. Say on, my loving lord. By Buckingham, I say I would be king. Why, so you are, my thrice renowned lord. Ah, am I king? 'Tis so, but Edward lives. True, noble prince. Oh, bitter consequence that Edward still should live. True, noble prince. Cousin, thou was not wont to be so dull. Shall I be plain? I wish the bastard's dead, and I would have it suddenly performed. What sayest thou now? Speak suddenly, be brief. Your grace may do your pleasure. Tut, thou at all ice thy kindness freezes. Say, shall I have thy consent that they shall die? Give me some little breath, some pause, dear Lord, before I positively speak of this. I will resolve you herein presently. And Buckingham retires. I will converse with iron-witted fools and unrespectful boys. None for me that look into me with considerate eyes. High-reaching Buckingham grows circumspect. Boy, my lord, knowest thou not any whom corrupting gold will tempt unto a close exploit of death? I know a discontented gentleman whose humble means match not his haughty spirit. Gold were as good as 20 orators, and will no doubt tempt him to anything. Ah, what is his name? His name, my lord, is Tyrrell. I partly know the man. Go call him hither, boy. The deep, revolving Buckingham no more shall be the neighbor to my counsels. Hath he so long held out with me untired, and stops he now for breath? Well, be it so. How now, Lord Stanley, what's the news? No, my loving lord, the Marquis Dorset, as I hear, is fled to Richmond and the parts where he abides. Is thy name Tyrrell? James Tyrrell, and your most obedient subject. Art thou indeed? Prove me, my gracious lord. Darest thou resolve to kill a friend of mine? Please you, but I had rather kill 2 enemies. Why then, thou hast it. 2 deep enemies, foes to my rest and my sweet sleep's disturbers, are they that I would have thee deal upon. Tyrrell, I mean those bastards in the tower. Let me have open means to come to them, and soon I'll rid you from the fear of them. Oh, thou sing sweet music. Hark, come hither, Tyrrell. Go by this token. Rise and lend thine ear. There's no more but so. Say it is done, and I will love thee and prefer thee for it. I will dispatch it straight. Re-enter Buckingham. My lord, I have considered in my mind the late demand that you did sound me in. Well, let that rest. Dorset is fled to Richmond. I hear the news, my lord. Stanley, he is your wife's son. Well, look unto it. My lord, I claim the gift, my due, my promise, for which your honor and your faith is pawned, the earldom of Hereford and the movables which you have promised I shall possess. Stanley, look to your wife. If she convey letters to Richmond, you shall answer for it. But what says your highness to my just request? I do remember Henry VI did prophesy that Richmond should be king when Richmond was a little peevish boy. King, perhaps. And my lord, how chance the prophet could not at that time have told me, I being by, that I should kill him?
My lord, your promise for the Earl of Richmond. When last I was at Exeter, the mayor in courtesy showed me the castle and called it Richmond. At which name I started because a bard of Ireland told me once I should not live long after I saw Richmond. My lord, what's o'clock? I am thus bold to put your grace in mind of what you promised me. Well, but what's o'clock? Upon the stroke of 10. Well, let it strike. Why let it strike? Because like a jack thou keeps the stroke that keeps the begging in my meditation. I am not in the giving vein today. Oh, why then resolve me whether you will or no. I'll trouble me